Good evening, everyone. It's a really great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you to the foundation and organizers for inviting me. I was here almost a decade ago. It's always wonderful to be back in Madrid. It's one of the great cities, not just of Europe, but the world. Art, culture, history, society. So I have many friends here, so it's great to be back here and so on. I was flying from Israel this morning to Madrid, and I was thinking for a moment about the Spanish flu. So I searched online, tried to figure out the origins of it, and turns out that it has nothing to do with Spain. At the end of World War I, the censors were censoring all the bad news. This flu came out of Kansas or somewhere in the U.S., but Spain was a neutral country, so it was not as much censorship of the press at that time as in Europe or other parts of Europe or US. So people thought that actually this flu pandemic had started in Spain, but nothing to do with Spain. But the name stuck. And of course, 100 years later, just 3 years ago at this time of the year, there was a start of the COVID-19 global pandemics. And as you know, it affected and upheaved all our lives, my lives, your lives, and so on. You had to figure out how you survive, how you maintain your jobs and income or your businesses, how you're going to make sure you don't get sick, or if you get sick, you don't get hospitalized, if not anything worse, how you take care of your children and let them be able to survive and study and manage, and what would happen to your savings, your income, and your wealth, and so on. So suddenly, out of nowhere, a tail risk came out that people did not expect and completely changed our own lives. But if you think of it about more broadly, today we live in a time of what I call unprecedented, unusual, and unexpected uncertainty. So 4 U's, not just one. We have risk, we have instability, we have turmoil around the world, we have volatility, potentially chaos, and we have a variety of risks and threats. In my new book, I call them mega threats because there are things that can affect significantly our jobs, our income, our economies, but also the planet and the future of humanity as well. I use the term mega threats, but this past year, one of the popular terms that came out that the Financial Times chose as one of the words of the year was the term of polycrisis, a combination of, like in my book, of economic, monetary, financial, but also social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, technological, and trade-related threats and risks that are all connected to each other. Each one affects the other and vice versa. So you have to understand them as a system. Thinking only about economic threats when you have political, geopolitical, environmental is not sufficient. Recently I was in Washington with the head of the IMF doing a book event on my book, and Kristalina Georgieva, the head of IMF, gave a speech talking about a confluence of calamities and saying that since World War II, we have never faced a moment of time this potential risk for the world and the world economy. So it doesn't matter whether you call them mega threats or whether you call them polycrisis or you call it a confluence of calamities. We're facing a world that is highly uncertain, where many things can go wrong. And of course, every crisis potentially has also solutions. But to resolve the problem, first we have to be aware of them, understand their consequences, and then figure out what we can do about them. Sometimes people tell me, aren't you too pessimistic? After all, since World War II, we have had 75, almost 80 years of relative peace, progress, and prosperity. And in some sense it's true, but I think these last 75 years can be split in 2 periods. I don't know about you, there are many young people, some of them closer to my age. I was born in Turkey in 1958, and then between Middle East and then Italy and Europe. I was there until I went to US for grad school in 1983. So I lived through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s before I went to the United States. But when I was growing up in those first 25 years of my life, and I think there was a golden period between 1945 and the early 80s, I never even heard the term global pandemics. Unless I read the history books, the last one had been the Spanish flu, 1918. And until the early 80s when we had HIV and AIDS, there was no real major global pandemics. When I was growing up, I never even heard about global climate change. Temperatures were barely above pre-industrial level in the 60s, even in the 70s. So nobody worried about climate change. There were concerns about the limits to growth. There was a Club of Rome that says there are too many people in the world, there's not going to be enough food and water. There was a concern about natural resources. That was not about climate itself. I never even worried about war between great powers or the risk of a nuclear war among great powers. After the détente in the early 70s between US and the Soviet Union, after Nixon went to China in the early 70s, the risk of war between US and these communist countries, it was already low before, but if not to zero, was very, very low. So never worried about that kind of stuff. When I was growing up, I never worried and even ever heard about artificial intelligence threatening with robotic and automation most jobs, because we're in the middle of what people call the AI winter. There was some research, there was zero applications, and nobody cared about it. Did I worry about trade wars, protectionism, deglobalization, fragmentation of the global economy? No. We had GATT, then the WTO, European Union, and more countries joined the European Union, in North America, NAFTA, and rounds of global trade liberalization. We even had hyper-globalization for the last 30 years, as first Russia, the former Soviet Union countries, China, India, emerging market, joined the global economy, global labor markets, and global supply chains. So it was liberalization of trade, not deglobalization. Did I worry about excessive debt leading to debt crisis? Debt ratios, private and public, were low and growth was high. So nobody worried about debt crisis. Did I worry about implicit debt coming from aging of populations? No, there were rising number of young people and workers, and their payroll taxes were paying for the benefit of the elderly. So there were no unfunded liabilities of implicit debt. Were there economic cycles? Yeah. There were some recessions. They tended to be mild most of the time. Yes, we had a pretty ugly decade in the 70s of stagflation because of oil shocks driven by politics in the Middle East. But they were followed by what was called the Great Moderation, 30 years of stable growth, low inflation, and rising values of risky assets like global equity, real estate, and you name it. Did I worry about financial crisis? Until the early 80s when you had the Latin American debt crisis, there were no really major financial crises. Banks and other financial institutions were properly regulated and supervised. There were capital controls. There were a form of financial repression. And the kind of toxic derivatives, financialization, and leverage that we have seen the last 30 years was not yet there. So there were cycles, but they were mild. Plus, most of the West and advanced economies lived in liberal democracies. Yeah, there were center-right parties, center-left, but not the kind of polarization between right and left we see today, or rise of extremist populist party of the extreme right or extreme left that you see around the world. And even in Europe, countries that were for a while authoritarian, Spain, Portugal, Greece, became democratic as they reached a certain level of income and the demand for democracy rose and they became part of Europe. So there were authoritarian countries, China, Soviet Union, and others tend to be poor countries. But most of the democracies were liberal and were stable. So that's at least the world in which I grew up. And I think that many of you are of my generation might also remember it. Now, if I fast forward to the present, I think that the last 20 years, certainly since the global financial crisis of 2007, 2009, things have changed. And we're facing today mega threats that really didn't even exist. They were not even in the back of my mind when I was growing up in that golden period that I defined as end of World War II through the early 1980s. First, today, we have a number of revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. They're effectively allied. And they're challenging the economic, monetary, trading, financial, political, geopolitical, and security order that the US, Europe, and their allies around the world created after World War II. We already have actually not just a new Cold War between US and China, but there is a hot war between Russia and Ukraine. And it's not just between Russia and Ukraine. This is really a proxy war between the West and Russia, or between the US and Russia. And this terrible war could become unconventional if Putin decides at some point to use tactical nuclear weapons to try to stop the advance of Ukrainian troops. Could also involve NATO. I don't know what's the probability, but that's the thing that we worry about. Henry Kissinger wrote a piece just last week saying that the Russia-Ukraine conflict could lead to World War III if it escalates in those directions. I just was in Israel, and Iran at this point is a threshold nuclear state. They've enriched uranium to a level to 60%, and going from 60 to 90, this weapon grade is just a matter of months. And Israel has to make a decision, tough, whether they do something about it or not, and what are the consequences for Israel, but for its allies, for the world, and also for the world economy. When you had all shocks like Yom Kippur War between Israel and Arab States 73, or Iranian Revolution, you had a doubling or tripling in oil prices, and we had global recession and inflation, stagflation. Those of you who are old enough to remember the 70s, I was there. Most younger people don't even know what stagflation was, because we haven't had it for now 50 years. So, and the entire Middle East has a broader conflict between Iran and their own Shiite proxies and the Sunni state that are rival. So it's powder keg. We have a number of failed states. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, potentially others. And it's at the borders of Europe. And those failed states, like Syria, led to a massive migration, say in 2015, that challenged then the institution of Europe and created a number of tensions within Europe that exist even today. And in Asia, there is this Cold War between US and China. It's not just on the issue of Taiwan, but who's going to be the hegemonic power in Asia. By the way, China has territorial disputes with half a dozen countries, not just Taiwan, with Japan, with India, with Malaysia, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, Indonesia, and you name it. And under some scenarios, this Cold War is becoming colder, could end up into a hot war between US and China on the issue of Taiwan. Just two months ago, the head of the US Navy said in an interview on the Financial Times that the risk of China invading Taiwan was a risk not 5 or 10 years from now. He said it could happen, he said, before 2024. This was October 2022. Before 2024 means 2023. We are 2023. I don't think it's going to happen this year, but eventually there'll be a collision on this issue. It's the old Thucydides trap. A rising power facing existing power leads most of the time to not just cold wars, but hot wars. So we're living in this geopolitical depression, and because of it, we have a decoupling, fragmentation of the global economy, deglobalization, balkanization of supply chains, friendshoring, secure trade, and all these things are happening slowly but steadily. On climate change, we could speak hours, and there are people who are better experts than me. I have a chapter in the book. Unfortunately, the cost of it are increasing, becoming more severe. This past summer, there were droughts in India, in Pakistan, Italy, most of Western Europe, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa. But half of the U.S. from Colorado to California was in drought. Most of Mexico, Central America. And the economic cost of these droughts and extreme weather events are becoming huge. And if you worry about 1 million Syrians coming to Europe in 2015, wait until there are dozens of millions of people in the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa because of climate change, failed states, desertification. We have to move somewhere else, and we're going to knock at the doors of Europe. And both Europe and even Biden's policy toward migration are not very different from Trump. They don't want to have a massive amount of Latin American refugees coming to the United States. So we're not going to accept it. So what's going to happen to them? And on climate change, unfortunately, there is too much greenwashing, green wishing, green fig leaves. Let's do this, let's do that, and talk about ESG, but in practice there is not very much substance. There is even greenflation, the kind of green metal that you need to build electric vehicles or electric batteries, lithium, zinc, copper, cobalt, require a lot of energy. And if the price of fossil fuel is high, the price of this green metal is high, and therefore the green transition becomes, more costly. Now, throughout my book, I point out that for each one of these 10 mega threats, there are solutions. The problem with the solution is that they all imply cost and sacrifices in the short run, and the benefits are only in the medium long term. And whether you're a democracy or even an authoritarian country, in democracy you have to get reelected, in autocracy you have to be popular. Very few people want to make the sacrifices that lead them to benefits because they're not going to be in power or they will be kicked out of power. 20 years ago, Gerhard Schröder, chancellor in Germany, did reforms of the labor market. He was a social democrat and he lost the next election. That's what happens when you do reforms. Macron wants to do a reform of pension system in France. I was recently in Paris. The worry is actually that this pension reform is so unpopular, people having to retire only at 64, 65, that actually there may be more demonstration than they happened when there was the Gilets jaunes a few years ago. And Le Pen, who has increased their popularity through 2 elections, might win the next presidential elections. If that were to happen, it could be the end of Europe, literally, because she's radical anti-Euro, even more so than others in Europe. That's a meaningful threat, that actually Le Pen wins in 2027, if you do stuff that is unpopular. But if you don't do stuff that is unpopular, people are going to say, what have you done? He doesn't have even a legislative majority, and he might still lose the election, meaning whoever is going to choose to be, because he cannot run in 2027. So on climate change, it's still hard. Mitigation means net zero implies negative economic growth. That is not acceptable. Adaptation is usually expensive, and geoengineering solutions are like freak science. So we don't have yet the right solution. By the way, if you wanted to achieve the Paris Accord goals of not having temperature above 1.5%, the average carbon tax in the world should be $200 per ton. Today, the average in the world is $2, less in the US, a little more in Europe. Which government is going to go and lead to 100 times increase from 2 to 200 of carbon taxes? Now that fuel taxes are high because of the energy crisis from Russia, everybody's cutting those carbon taxes and fuel taxes, the opposite of what you want to do if you want to have the energy transition. So those are the bottlenecks and constraints, among others, to do the right thing. On global pandemics, is COVID something like a freak episode? It was terrible, but highly unlikely to happen. After all, a severe one like the Spanish flu occurred only in 1918. Think of it this way. Between 1918 and 1981 or so, for several decades, there was almost no major global pandemic, literally almost none. And suddenly, from 1980 on, we had HIV, AIDS, SARS, MERS, swine flu, various episodes of bird flu, Zika, Ebola, COVID-19, monkeypox, and it's going to be only a matter of time whether it's COVID-23 or 24 or something else, is going to come out. They're becoming more frequent, more virulent, and more dangerous. Why, suddenly? For 70 years, nothing, and then suddenly you have one after the other every other year. Turns out that many other reasons is that there is a relation, this is the connection between these type of threats, between climate change and global pandemics. Because as we destroy animal ecosystems through climate change, and we encroach on them, those animals that carry pathogens, bats, pangolins, and others, get closer to livestock animal and to humans. And they're called zoonotic diseases because they transfer from animal to human. So that transmission from animal to human becomes more likely as we destroy the planet. So the two things are not uncorrelated, and because of that, it's going to get worse. And this is not the last one, it's not going to be the worst one. Climate change releases a huge amount of methane. The tundra in Siberia is melting. Methane is coming out. Methane has 10 times more greenhouse gas emissions than CO2. It's a disaster. And there are pathogens, freaky viruses and bacteria were frozen in the tundra or in Greenland that actually they've recently discovered as things get defrosted. So God knows which kind of freaky viruses being frozen for thousands of millions of years could emerge and which kind of disease can come out. So all these things are linked to each other. Now, short term, of course, some of these threats are medium long term. Risk of major war, another huge pandemic, and things of that sort. In the short term, we have to worry about the fact that there is a return of inflation, and not only inflation, but also recession. It's odd. Usually when you have inflation, you have strong economic growth, too much demand. And when there's a recession, you have deflation because there's not enough demand. But this phenomenon of high inflation and negative growth is called stagflation. And it happens like in the 70s when you have a negative aggregate supply shocks. In the case of the current rise in inflation, there's a debate on how much of it was driven by bad policies, too loose monetary, fiscal, and credit easing, too much and for too long. We needed some of it during COVID, but we did too much of it. Or how much of it was due to bad luck. We had 3 negative supply shocks during COVID. One was the initial impact of COVID on production of goods and services, on the supply of labor, and shutting down global supply chains. The second one was, of course, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on commodity prices, natural gas, oil, food, fertilizers, industrial metals. And 3, the zero COVID policy of China, until recently also created supply bottlenecks. So it was a combination, of course, of both bad policy and bad luck. But even if these negative supply shocks related to COVID, Russia, Ukraine were to disappear, the point I make in the book is that more likely than not, in the next decade or so, we're going to see stagflation because there are more medium to long-term negative supply shocks that reduce production and growth, increase cost of production, and we lose monetary and fiscal policy that lead to inflation and recession, stagflation. I identify about a dozen of them in the book. I don't have time to go in much detail, but think of it this way. Protectionism and deglobalization. Reduces growth, causes cost of production rising. Look at what's happening today in the UK. They shot themselves in the foot with Brexit. The growth is lower. They have the highest inflation. Even the Bank of England expects 6 quarters, 1 year and a half of recession. That's pure stagflation. Now we talk about secure trade rather than free trade. We also have reshoring of manufacturing from south to north, from poor to rich, from China to other countries, reshoring or friendshoring. We want to have safe global supply chains. We want to have multiple ones, just in case rather than just in time. Redundancy causes cost frictions that are reducing growth and increase cost of production. We have aging of populations, both in advanced economies, but also in emerging markets, China, Russia, Taiwan, South Korea. Aging tends to be inflationary because young people work, produce, and tend to save. Older people tend to retire, not produce, and they consume, they dissave. The impact is stagflationary. In the past, we had massive amounts of migration from south to north, from poor to rich, to Europe, to the United States, and that kept the lead on wage growth. Now we're restricting migration, and that's going to be one of the reasons, maybe rightly so, labor is stronger, but it's going to cause wage inflation more than the past. This geopolitical depression and this decoupling between US and China, as I said, is going to cause balkanization and reduction of growth and increasing cost of international trade in goods, in services, movement of capital, labor, data, technology, information. Climate change, by the way, is also stagflationary. Even before Russian invasion of Ukraine, food prices were spiking. Why? You have droughts all over the world, desertification, lack of water, food prices rise. Or it has an impact on energy cost. While rightly bashing producers of oil, natural gas, fossil fuels, say you're emitting all this emission, we tell them, shareholders and stakeholders, don't finance them. They have underinvested in new capacity for many years now, but the rise of production of renewable has not compensated for that. So there is a structural supply lack given demand, and even without the war between Russia and Ukraine, energy prices will be high. Goldman Sachs is predicting that actually this year commodity prices are going to go up 40%, and not just energy, all the other ones, because copper, zinc, cobalt, all the other ones, there is also underinvestment, and because of that there's not enough supply. When the supply is low, demand is high, prices are higher. So inflation is not going to fall very much if commodity prices can go up 40% this year. That's a view of a leading investment house. Of course, pandemics are stagflationary. They reduce production, they increase cost of production, all the bottlenecks we've seen, and more of them are going to happen. There'll be also cyber warfare. When you do cyber warfare, you shut down the production of a firm or a government, or if you have to protect yourself, you spend a fortune, billions, and that's costly as well. A couple of final factors that are stagflationary. There's been a huge rise in income and wealth inequality all over the world, and now there's a backlash against it. That's why there's also a backlash against liberal democracy. And fiscal policy are becoming, rightly so, pro-labor, pro-union, pro-workers, pro-people left behind, pro-people that have been hurt by globalization, trade, migration, whatever, minorities, and you name it. Because if you don't do it, we know that when there is too much inequality, there is social strife, there is tension, there is violence, even revolution are caused by excessive inequality. And those social policies are going to be increasing reservation wages, increasing the share of labor, rightly so, but then it's going to feed into wage inflation and inflation. Final factors, the US, but also now its allies, are weaponizing the dollar and other reserve currencies to punish through trade and financial sanctions their rivals. And in the case of Russia, it was not just sanctioning dollars reserves, but all the other reserves, pounds, euros, and whatever not. But as we do that, those strategic rivals of the US may diversify the reserves away from dollar assets. They might go into gold and other ones. That could, one, lead to a disorderly fall of the value of the dollar that is inflationary. And as you create frictions in the payment system of international trade, it's sand in the wheels that creates friction and higher cost, because dollars or euros or yen are needed to make payments on all the variety of international trade in goods and services, technology, data, information, and capital. So that's also stagflationary. And that's on the supply side. On the demand side, and I have a few chapters about the risk of the mother of all debt crisis, we live in a world in which debt, private and public, as a share of GDP, has exploded for the last 50 years. Private debt is debt of workers, households, businesses, corporations, banks, and other financial institutions. Public debt is the debt of central and local governments. That debt ratio in the 70s was 100% of GDP. By 2000 was almost 200%. Last year was 350% of GDP. In advanced economy, 420 and rising. Now, until recently, debt ratios were high, but debt servicing ratios were low because we had zero policy rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, credit easing. So that was high, but the interest you paid on it was very low, short and long. 2 years ago, about $18 trillion of equivalent of public debt in Europe and Japan at a yield that was negative, in nominal terms, negative, you remember, on the short and the long end. Mortgages in Denmark and corporate debt in some country at a negative interest rate. Interest rates were so low. But we were lucky because in the two previous shocks, the global financial crisis and the beginning of COVID, there was a demand shock, a credit crunch, and you had deflation. So we could do massive monetary, fiscal, and credit easing and help everybody and keep interest rates low even if the debt were high. Unfortunately, that part is over because now we have inflation. Central banks have to increase interest rates to fight inflation, and therefore the cost of borrowing for the government, mortgages, auto loans, student loans, credit cards, personal loans, business loans, corporate debt, and so on is rising, and those who are highly leveraged are going to be under financial stress and at risk of default. That's why I fear that the current recession is not going to be short and shallow. It's going to be one severe because inflation is going to remain higher than otherwise. Central banks will have to increase interest rates more than they expect today. My view is the ECB is not going to be able to stop at 3% on one side, and there is so much debt in the system that we are in the debt trap. If we raise interest rates to fight inflation, not only because of an economic crash, we can risk a crash in the stock market, bond yields, credit spreads, borrowing costs, and so on, and the two feed on each other and make it a more severe recession. And on top of explicit debt of the government, we have also implicit debt. The number of younger people is shrinking, we're restricting migration, the number of elderly is going up, and the payroll taxes of the young have to pay for the benefits of the old, and when the young are going to be retired, there's not going to be enough money for them, and therefore we have to do pension reforms that are political and popular, and so on. Now, given that there's so much debt, my view is that eventually governments are going to wipe out the real value of that debt with inflation. Because if you have nominal fixed interest rate debt, surprise inflation can reduce the real value of the debt. Meaning if you don't want to raise tax or cut spending, the path of risk resistance is the inflation tax. And that's why debt ratio have fallen this past year, because inflation has surprised on the upside, even in Spain. So unfortunately we'll end up in equilibrium where on the supply side you have negative supply shocks. There is so much debt that you have to monetize it, and then equilibrium is inflation, recession, stagflation, but you don't avoid the debt crisis because eventually interest rates become higher and becomes unsustainable. You're just postponing the problem. All of these problems are also leading, together with the rise in inequality, to a backlash against liberal democracy, unfortunately. Across the world, advanced economies, emerging markets, you have Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, Meloni was elected in Italy, Le Pen could win in France. These neo-Nazis, Swedish Democrats are part of the coalition in Sweden. You have the Brexit phenomenon was a populist backlash. In the US you had the Trump phenomenon. And on the left, in Latin America, it used to be the case that you had a couple of populists of the left, Argentina, Venezuela, but look at the last 2 or 3 years, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Brazil, they all moved to some degree of populism of the left, to different degrees of extremism, but it is so. And in Brazil, the choice was between an authoritarian populist of the right, dangerous like Bolsonaro, and a Lula that in his second mandate did terrible. First administration of Lula was okay. And think about the risk that is coming to liberal democracy. In the US, we had January 6th of 2021, almost a military coup, failed. Just last week, you had something similar happening in Brazil. Those of you who are old enough remember 1981, I think it was February 23rd, when there was an attempted military coup and your parliament was taken over for a day. It failed. But you cannot take democracy for granted. And unfortunately, when there is economic malaise, when people feel they are threatening their economic future and their children, where there is a rising income and wealth inequality, people become more radical, become more authoritarian. In authoritarian regimes, when things don't go well at home, they go and fight wars, like Putin did in Ukraine, like the Argentine did in the Falklands, and there have been tons of other examples. Same thing could happen with China, becoming aggressive if economically they have a hard landing at home. That's the nature of authoritarian regimes. They become authoritarian. Now, as I pointed out, for each one of these threats, there are solutions, and I discuss them one by one. And I have 2 chapters in the book, one about the dystopian future and one about the more utopian one. But to achieve a better world, we cannot start with wishful thinking, just do a shopping list of, say, if we only do this, and this, or if we had better leaders, things will be well. 1. 2, we cannot take the last 75 years of peace, progress, and prosperity for granted. Because as I pointed out, in those 75 years, the first 40 were this way. In the last 20 years, we've had the emergence of all these threats that are becoming more and more severe. And therefore, the assumption that the future is going to be like the near past is not necessarily true. The future could be not like the near past, but stuff that happened before. And those 75 years of peace and prosperity were preceded, as you remember, those of you read the history books, by 30 years. Between 1914 and 1945, there was an utter disaster. In spite of the first industrial revolution, in spite of the first era of globalization, we did not prevent World War I. Actually, we sleepwalked into World War I. And after World War I, we had the Spanish flu. Then we had the stock market crash of 29, the beginning of the Great Depression, trade wars, currency wars, inflation, hyperinflation, deflation, financial crisis, debt defaults. Then Hitler came to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, other authoritarians in Japan, and then we had World War II. And then we had the Holocaust. Only after that utter disaster, we created an institution, national and global, of governance that avoided all that mess again and gave us this peace and prosperity. And in some sense, not only today in the mega threats that I talked today look more like the period between 1914 and 1945. In some sense, they are worse. Why worse? In those 30 years that were ugly, you didn't have to worry about climate change. It didn't even exist, right? You didn't have to worry about AI destroying most jobs. There were not even computers at that time. You didn't have to worry about implicit liability coming from aging. U.S. created Social Security in the 30s, and people would die on average before they would qualify for benefits. So it was a fully funded working system. And World War II, as ugly as it was, or World War I, brutal murder of people, military and civilian, was conventional until the end. It was only in 1945 that luckily U.S. got the nuclear bomb rather than the Nazis, and unfortunately used it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. Today, if there was a war between great powers, Russia and U.S., China, U.S., or otherwise, and the strategic rivals of the U.S., China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan, they all have the bomb. Iran effectively at this point. A war that starts conventional between great powers is going to soon become unconventional. It's guaranteed, right? That's going to be the case. And it will be a nuclear winter, would then be just a conventional war. So that's the kind of things we have to think about when we think about the future. Now, they call me Dr. Doom, and I fear that I might have depressed you by giving you the warning about the stuff. But it's a call to arms. Is there hope? Maybe. But the hope has to come from stop kicking the can down the road, stop putting our heads in the sand as if we were ostriches, stop pushing the snooze button every time somebody sounds the alarm and says There are risks and threats we have to address. Stop living like zombies who pretend that we live in a world that is like it used to be, where there are threats and continue sleepwalking into disaster. And realize that each of us individually, we can do stuff. We can do it also collectively by being organized, whether social movements or political and so on, to resolve these problems in our own towns, in our own villages, in our communities, in our societies, but also find a global solution, because most of these problems are global and there's no national solution. Climate change, pandemic, economic and financial crisis, trade integration, global peace and security. There cannot be national solution. Today, there's a backlash against globalization and globalists. They say the globalists are the elite, this and that, they care only about themselves. But the success of the last 75 years were driven by globalization. Europe alone, if it had not united, would be a bunch of small countries that have no influence on global affairs. Even Germany is a uber power economically, geopolitically immediate without Europe, in a world in which you have China, US, India, and so on. So European integration gives leverage to Europe. And countries like Spain and others greatly have benefited. Not that globalization doesn't have its own pitfalls, has to be sustainable, has to be inclusive, let's make sure people are not left behind. But we live in a connected world where everything affects everything else. Problems are global. You have to provide global public goods and you need global governance, whether we like it or not. And I think that Europe is a success story from that point of view. In spite of all the problems, uniting, integrating has been good for Europe. It's going to continue to be good if Europe sticks together as opposed to divides each other together. So my point is, and I'll conclude on that, we have to stop essentially living in a dream. It's going to become a nightmare. We have to be aware. We have to get organized. We have to be serious about it, and individually and collectively make sacrifices that are going to be painful, but the benefits for ourselves, our children, and humanity at best over time. And I hope that we're going in that direction, that is the utopian one, as opposed to a more dystopian one. So it's a call to action. The time to act is now, not wait until the future. We have to start now to change the world for the better. Thank you.